Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Thank you for joining us. The topic of today's program is an overview of intrafamilial sexual abuse. We'll take a look at the difficult process of the investigation, the dynamics that surround the issue, and the treatment with our guest, Suann Kenney-Noziska. She is a licensed independent social worker and registered play therapist supervisor, specializing in clinical practice with sexually abused children, adolescents, and their families. She has over 17 years of experience in the field, and her work in the area of sexual abuse treatment has been presented throughout the nation. Suann, welcome to Fronteras.
Thank you for having me.
If we could start out by you giving us a basic understanding of how cases of sexual abuse are investigated in Doña Ana County.
Investigation of these cases is really complicated. It typically involves law enforcement and also the child welfare system. Here in Las Cruces, it's Children, Youth, and Families Department. And so when the cases get reported, they get cross-reported to the other entity. So for example, if somebody calls the sexual abuse allegation into law enforcement, they would cross-report to CYFD. And likewise, if it's called into CYFD, it gets cross-reported to law enforcement. And then at that point, investigators go out. Depending on the timeline would depend on how high of a risk the case is. And that would start the investigation, interviewing the children, interviewing family members, interviewing the alleged perpetrator.
Over time in Doña Ana County, and how have there been an increase in reports of sexual abuse, say in the last 10 years?
National statistics are that childhood sexual abuse, the rates are actually going down, and there's all kinds of reasons that could be going on, but I think there's more awareness in the community, and so people are more aware of childhood sexual abuse, more likely to be able to protect and support children. I do think that under this economy, with the stress and with all of the issues that are going on in the community, that does increase the impact of abuse of children, including sexual abuse.
And do you feel like in this type of economy that people might be more afraid to report cases of sexual abuse, or are they more open to wanting to report them?
I think it depends on the situation. If there's been previous reports, or if there's undocumented individuals in the family, they're less likely to file reports than other types of situations.
What is the Doña Ana County Child Abuse Protocol?
It's actually a formal protocol that's written up as a collaboration from the DA's office, the Child Welfare, CYFD, and from law enforcement and other agencies. And basically it delineates who is responsible for what type of the investigation and in what order things should happen. So for example, an investigator goes out and interviews the child, and at that point they might recommend a forensic interview, which is a fact-finding interview. And when they organize that, it's scheduled. It usually happens at the Child Advocacy Center, which is at Families and Youth Incorporated. And when they do that interview, they try to make sure that they have a representative from law enforcement, child welfare, as well as the DA's office. So that way the child's only interviewed once. They also then make decisions about whether or not the child needs a SANE evaluation, which is the medical evaluation to collect medical evidence, and then what steps to take in order to protect the child at that point.
In terms of staffing, is Doña Ana County well staffed to serve the wide range in this community of people, to be able to go out and investigate these cases?
We certainly do the best we can with the limited resources. One thing that I can say for sure is that the people who do respond are truly dedicated and aware that this is a social problem, but that it greatly impacts the kids and families in our community.
Help us better understand the intrafamilial sexual, what it is, and am I pronouncing it correctly?
You are pronouncing it correctly. Intrafamilial sexual abuse. Contrary to what most people think, sexual abuse happens at the hands of somebody that child knows. 80% of childhood sexual abuse happens at the hands of a family member. But in our minds, we think that it's the homeless man that abducts children from school and sexually victimizes them in the bushes. But those are the exceptions. Those are the ones you hear about on the news. But what's more common is sexual abuse by someone in the family, a relative, a grandfather. Also, females perpetrate sexual abuse. Grandmothers and aunts, moms can also be the offenders of sexual abuse. So most childhood sexual abuse happens in a family, which also creates barriers for that child disclosing, because it's not a stranger, it's someone that the child has loyalty to, someone that's important to them and important to their family.
So, and I guess I'm going to use the word taboo, to describe this, but, how taboo is it for, family members to, be willing to report on each other, on family members, and, or they want to keep it a secret?
Actually, most families, I don't know if it's necessarily wanting to keep it a secret per se, but families are ill-equipped on how to respond. And it's very hard for them to believe that, for example, let's say the mother finds out that the daughter is saying, Dad is sexually abusing me. It's going to be really hard for mom to accept that, to understand that this man that she's married to, that she's been intimate with, that she has children with, would do sexual things to her child. And so families typically turn to other family members for guidance on what to do. And then really what that does is it just involves more people in the sexual abuse. The sexual abuse doesn't truly stop and the family doesn't get help until somebody outside the home is contacted, like the authorities. But again, there's that fear of, if I call, what's going to happen? Is my child going to get taken away? Are people going to believe me? He's saying he didn't do it. She's saying he did. So it's really a complicated process for families to go through.
And what we're talking about, ages 18 and under of children that are abused, and what is something that a mom could do right away if she were to hear that something is happening? Again, as you mentioned, that some find it easier to talk about it within the family but don't report it.
The number one thing for people to do if a child says to them that they're being sexually abused is to believe that child and support that child. I'm sorry that this is happening. You're brave for telling. I'm going to take steps to make sure you're safe. And then make that call. Call law enforcement, call the statewide centralized intake unit, SCI, and make that report. Let the authorities do their job. It's ridiculous to think that we have experts that can't make decisions in courts of law about who's lying and who's telling the truth. So it's unreasonable to think that a mom's going to be able to sort that out on her own. Believe the child, take steps to protect the child, and make that report.
What strategies, again, as you hear the taboo topics of people saying, well, the somebody driving around in a van kidnapping kids, but what strategies do these family members use to gain access to the children?
Childhood sexual abuse is a very gradual process. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not like one day all of a sudden, and we'll just use the example of a father sexually abusing his daughter. It's not as if one day he just decides, I'm going to go into a room and start to do sexual things to her. He sets her up, he grooms her, he does things to get her to trust him, to build that close relationship, to isolate her from other people in the family. He sets it up so that when he actually starts to do sexual touching to her, the sexual contact acts, she doesn't even realize what's been happening because she's been socialized to increasingly more intrusive physical contact and sexual contact. So telling sex jokes, making sexual comments, rubbing the child's back, horseplay with the child, but then actually rubbing up against the child's breasts. So if the child were to say anything, oh, well, Dad touched me, Dad would easily say, well, it was an accident, I was wrestling. So he's doing two things when he does that. Number one, he's testing to see is she going to say anything. And number two, he's getting her used to that type of sexual contact. It's very similar to the way we gain weight. It's not like I'm going to go to bed and tomorrow I'm going to wake up 25 pounds heavier. It happens gradually, maybe 2 pounds here, maybe over the holidays I gain another 3 pounds. Well, down the road, voila, I've gained 15 pounds. Sexual abuse is gradual like that. It's little things that happen long before that first sexual touch occurs. And just as hard as offenders work to groom and entice children, they actually are working as equally hard to seduce us as adults, to convince us, I'm a good guy, I would never do that. I think anyone who sexually abuses a child should be locked away for life. So then when we find out a child's being sexually abused, we can't quite wrap our head around how would that happen, because he's such a good guy and he's the one that takes her everywhere and he buys her the presents, and there's no way that good person could be committing a sex crime.
And I guess an observation or a question is, you often hear, oh, we should have known. This is what we were seeing. And what are some signs that parents should be looking out for as far as family members go to take notice that, you know what, the behavior is different and here's what I've noticed?
Sometimes it's really hard. It's going to be different in every case. Typically, once we find out there's sexual abuse and the family gets treatment, ideally what we would like is for that non-offending caregiver, so for example, if the offender is the father, the mom would be the non-offending caregiver. We would want her to be able to go back in her mind and say, now that I know the sexual abuse was going on, I remember back when he used to go and tuck her in at night and he'd spend like 20 minutes tucking her in. And our 5-year-old son, he'd spend 2 minutes, but our 11-year-old daughter, he'd spend 20 minutes. And I thought it was odd, and now I know why he was doing that. So there's all kinds of different red flags. Sometimes we see kids that start to have emotional or behavioral difficulties. They start wetting the bed, or they start having nightmares, or they become very clingy, or their mood is very irritable. Things that typically didn't bother them now set them off, or their grades start to go down. Now that can happen even when a child's not being sexually abused, but sometimes those changes in behaviors and mood can be red flags that there's something going on for the child. That's when it would serve somebody in the family well to sit down and say, I noticed that you're having a hard time. I wonder if there's anything that's going on.
What is sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
The sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is actually a conceptualization that was formed back in the early 80s by Ronald Summit. And it was created specifically to help dispel some of the myths that we have in society and in the legal system, and law enforcement and social workers may have about kids that are sexually abused, because oftentimes when kids tell, they appear to be not credible or they recant their statement. And so the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a framework that kind of helps us understand this is the process of sexual abuse. So it starts out with secrecy. When kids are sexually abused, it happens in secret. So nobody else knows what's going on. That's what makes it sexual abuse. And because of that secrecy, kids feel helpless. No one knows this is going on. It's happening by my dad, and so I don't really know what to do about that. So then they feel trapped and they try to accommodate. There's nothing that I can do because no one else knows about this. I'm helpless to stop it because it's my father. So in my mind, I have to tell myself it's really not that bad. Or I can take this, at least he's not sexually abusing my sister. And then eventually kids get to the point where they may make a disclosure. Most childhood sexual abuse is disclosed when people are adults. It's rarely disclosed in childhood, because to disclose childhood sexual abuse is usually very disastrous for kids. They're not believed or supported. So a child does get to the point of disclosing, and that disclosure is delayed. They didn't disclose right away. And we all tell children, if you're sexually abused, someone touches your private parts, tell right away. So just by the nature of that disclosure being delayed, it makes people question, well, is it real? Because she knew she was supposed to tell. And then families don't know how to respond, and that child feels pressure, and they typically recant. They take their statement back. And so that's the sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, really a way to help us understand this is why kids don't tell right away, and this is why kids might take their statements back.
As we talk about this particular portion of sexual abuse, and it's, again, now it's discussed, it's out there, has there been an increase in reporting of sexual child abuse by the children while it's happening, or is it still the same? Is there not enough education that's going on out there for people, for children to look for these kind of things?
I don't know if it's so much education per se. I do think as a society we are getting better at getting out into the schools and making sure that kids know if someone touches your private parts, it's okay to tell someone. The dilemma is kids truly struggle with telling, because again, it's not a stranger, it's a family member. And so there's that loyalty. So kids grapple with, who do I tell? What do I tell them? When do I tell them? And that's a lot of pressure for kids. when we do studies on the disclosure process for kids, what studies suggest is that kids start to tell bits and pieces to different adults in their life, and they're trying to figure out which adult is most likely to believe me, and is that the adult that I should disclose to. So what happens is they may say to an aunt, you know, I had this dream that dad came in my bedroom and was touching my private parts. And if the aunt says, oh, gross, your dad would never do that, the message to the child is, don't tell the aunt, because she's not going to believe you. So then the child goes to another adult and says, well, you know, I saw this movie, and in the movie the daughter was being sexually abused by her dad. And the adult's like, oh, that would never happen in our family. So again, the message is don't tell. So then they tell another adult and they say, well, you know, my friend told me that her uncle is blah, blah, blah. So then when the child does finally make a disclosure and all the adults start comparing stories, and then this adult says, well, you know, she told me it was her friend. Well, she told me it was a movie. Well, she told me it was a dream. It looks like the child's not being truthful. But the fact of the matter is, that's really understanding the way sexual abuse is disclosed. So all of these obstacles are things that kids kind of weigh out. Am I going to be believed? What's going to happen to me? And am I going to be taken away? What's going to happen to my dad? Is he going to get in trouble? Is he going to retaliate against me? What are people going to think of me? So those barriers just make it very difficult for kids to tell.
In terms of intrafamilial sexual abuse, are there more boys or are there more girls that are being abused?
Right now, the current statistics are kids under the age of 18, it's about 1 out of every 3 girls and 1 out of every 5 to 6 boys are being sexually abused. And again, 80% of that happens at the hands of a family member. With the boys, we do believe that that statistic is a little bit low. There's lots of additional obstacles and barriers for boys. Number one, boys being the victim of a sex crime has a taboo in addition to just being a victim in general. But then also there's a concern for boys that have been offended by adult males that I might be gay, and there's still that stigma with homosexuality. So that creates additional barriers for boys. So because of that, we believe that statistic is a little bit low. But it happens to both boys and girls in rich families and poor families in every community in our country.
What treatment options are available for victims of sexual abuse?
When kids have been sexually abused, we know more about effective ways of providing treatment now than we ever have. Individual therapy for that child, and in that situation, helping them understand the abuse is not their fault, expressing their feelings, being able to talk about what's happened to them without it being overwhelming and triggering maladaptive defenses or a decompensation. Treatment for the entire family. One really good treatment option for victims is group therapy, and that's where they're actually in treatment with other kids their age that have been sexually abused. And the thing that does is it reduces that sense of stigma and isolation. It's one thing for me to say to a child, you're not the only one. I know lots of other kids, but it's completely different to go into a room and see 6 other kids your age that have also been sexually abused. So that group process is very powerful.
Do you see any cases of older kids abusing younger kids?
Yeah, we see a lot of that. In fact, that's becoming more and more common. I think it's not that it hasn't always happened, but I think it's getting reported more often, and there's more awareness that there's treatment options out there. So when we look at, for example, teenagers, male or females, that sexually offend against younger children, what we're trying to do in the treatment field is refer to those individuals as adolescents with illegal sexual behavior instead of juvenile sex offender or adolescent sex offenders, because there's a qualitative difference between adult sex offenders and what motivates them to perpetrate a sex crime and adolescents who sexually abuse younger children. So we do see that, and there are treatment options for those adolescents as well.
It's very easy to look at sexual offenders of children and, call them monsters. Are they monsters? Can they be helped? I mean, what are their options? Besides prison or besides, the stigma that comes with this.
Well, the justice piece is certainly one aspect of it. When we look at adult sex offenders, there's 2 broad categories. There's situational offenders and there's preferential offenders. Situational offenders are offenders who actually, their preferred sex mate would be an adult, but for whatever reason they're turning to a child. these tend to be people that have less victims. They tend to sexually victimize their own children. Now that's in stark comparison to the preferential adult sex offender. That's the pedophile. Most men who perpetrate sexual abuse or women who perpetrate sexual abuse are not pedophiles. They don't prefer children. Preferential offenders, they do prefer children. They are sexually aroused to children. It doesn't matter if it's the most beautiful, attractive adult in the world, they're not going to be sexually attracted to that person. Preferential offenders are the ones that are very dangerous. They do not respond to treatment and they should not be around children.
As a family member or a child that might be watching this, or somebody that might look and say, I know of a child that's going through that, what's the first step that they should do? What should they do? Should they confront the adult that's causing the problem? Should they consult with the other parent, or what should they do?
If an adult suspects that a child is being sexually abused, ask the child. And if the child says that they are being sexually abused, believe them, and then file the report. If you go to talk to the offender is going to say, no, I'm not doing that. File the report, call law enforcement, call CYFD, and let the authorities intervene. Because in that way, you're most likely to be helpful and less likely to be harmful. If you intervene on your own without the skills to do that type of work, then it could very well be that it shuts down that child, their only opportunity to reach out and tell someone it's happening.
As far as the treatment for the children, how many of them are able to move past this and lead a normal life of being able to gain trust again?
There's certain factors that can lead to a better outcome. The first thing is the sooner kids get treatment, the better they are down the road. Especially teenage kids will say they don't need treatment, but they do need treatment. They need at least to be assessed for treatment. But one of the things that is one of the most influential factors in how kids do post-sexual abuse and down the road is whether or not they're believed and supported. That's why an adult's initial response and belief and protection of that child is paramount.
What, if there are organizations, you go and speak to organizations and you do a lot of this in private practice, are there ways that, again, that they can, who can they call to get information and perhaps learn more about things that they can look out for?
We have a great agency in town, La Piñon Sexual Assault and Recovery Services. They're phenomenal. They have advocates, they do outreach, they have all kinds of resources for victims and their families. They go out to schools and to other organizations to provide education on childhood sexual abuse and how to respond. So La Piñon is a great resource for Donna Ana County.
So in terms of cases, about how many cases do we look at here in Doña Ana County alone?
I'm not familiar with what the statistics are. I've only been in this community for 5 years, and I know that I don't believe there's any statistics that say sexual abuse is more common here in New Mexico than it was in California, which is the community I came from, but I feel it more here. And I don't know if it's because it's a smaller community, but it does appear to be more widespread.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in and talk to us. My guest has been Suann Kenney-Noziska. And in closing, do you have any closing thoughts on the subject matter?
If someone were to take away just one piece of information from listening to this, if a child says they're being sexually abused, believe that child, file a report, and take steps to make sure that that child is safe.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Ms. Suann Kenney-Noziska for coming in and joining us here on Fronteras. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Thank you.